I just want to touch on a few neuropsychological findings from your chapter. These are lifted right from the text, of course, but I just want to draw your attention to a few things. What researchers have found is that everybody that is visualizing showed massive activation in the parts of the brain important for visual processing, mostly in the occipital lobe, as you might expect, and other posterior regions, which they mean toward the back, during an imagery task. During other tasks, however, there were no such increases in blood flow to those parts. So I may have mentioned just in passing in a previous video that when you have a song in your head, there are parts of the temporal lobe that are activated. It's kind of interesting that when you're visualizing, there are aspects of the occipital lobe, the visual cortex, that's activated. So for what it's worth, kind of expected. Regions are often located in the occipital lobe, that region of the cerebral cortex devoted to visual processing. In one study, Koslin and others tested 12 volunteers to form images of previously memorized line drawings of common objects. They were asked to form their images in different sizes. During the task, the cerebral blood flow of the volunteers was monitored using PETs. Results indicated that all the imagery tasks produced activation in the visual cortex, replicating many previous findings. And of greater interest was the fact that the specific area of the occipital lobe showing the maximum activation differed depending on whether the image created was small, medium, or large. So the size of the image actually governed the volume of activity. It was kind of cool. Two other authors showed additionally, in a functional magnetic resonance imaging study, fMRI, that we talked about before, that when people form a mental image of faces, a different area of the brain becomes activated than when they imagine a place. When participants formed images of faces, the fusiform face area of the brain was activated, the same area that becomes activated when participants view photographs of faces, and that's in the occipital lobe. By the way, interestingly, the fusiform face area is kind of analogous to Broca's or Wernicke's. It's a very narrow part of the brain that everybody shares that apparently is dedicated to doing just one thing. So one of the things about neuroscience is that we do find particular things that have narrow functions, particular aspects of the brain parts. When participants formed a mental image of a place, the parahippocampal place area of the brain was active, just as it is when people view photographs of complex scenes. So right away you've got this fusiform face area and you've got the parahippocampal place area, two different things that apparently have narrow functions, one dedicated to perceiving faces, images of faces, and the other of places. And when we imagine those places or faces, they tend to be alighted, just as is the case with the occipital lobe generally. Kind of cool. It's interesting that it's so narrow. One last note, Koslin, who's busy as you could tell, argued that their data are also evidence against the propositional account of visual images, which we talked about before. The fact that visual processing areas become active when visual images are formed makes a strong case for the proposal that images are processed visually and not spatially. Or spatially, and that the findings from purely cognitive tasks are not simply produced by people's tacit theories of how imaginal processing ought to function. In other words, we've got some concrete evidence that visual and spatial processing by imaging is actually tapping those brain areas, and this would go against that propositional model. You'll remember the propositional model said things that it's just a matter of knowledge that New York is southwest of Boston, and it's a matter of knowledge that Reno is west of Los Angeles, etc. We can actually begin to imagine those things. And it can't purely be a matter of semantic facts along the lines of George Washington having wooden teeth or being the first president. Those things may be merely semantic, whereas we find other things that have to be, to some degree, visual.